Story 1. After EastEnders, the popular TV soap in the UK, finishes here, the national grid has to compensate for the extreme increase in demand for electricity due to everyone going for a cup of tea at the same time. Story 2. Coffee, that devil's bean, arrived in Finland around 1700 and has since been banned not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times in Finland. Apparently, it was too much fun for the common folk. It was considered unhealthy and needed to be banned. Every time the ban was lifted, and now an average Finn consumes 10 kilograms of coffee per year. Also, people used to drink coffee with salt here. Story 3. Australia, going to buck the trend and not nominate the Emu War. Back in colonial days, rum was used as currency, and the distribution of rum was controlled by the military. When the governor tried to limit the use of rum as currency and break the military's monopoly, the military overthrew him and set up a military junta. Story 4. The last World War II prisoner of war to be ever released was a Hungarian veteran named Toma Andris, who wasn't released until 2000. The reason for that was he was captured by Russians, who thought he was insane and speaking gibberish. So, Toma was held captive at a Siberian mental asylum until a Slovak doctor came around and noticed that he was, in fact, just speaking Hungarian. Story 5. In the cellar of one of our castles, we have a sleeping statue of a Viking warrior called Holger Dansk, and he supposedly will arise and defend Denmark if we are in danger. He obviously didn't think much of the Nazis since he slept right through that one, but I'm excited to see if the Americans can light a spark in him or something. Edit. That's probably more a myth than history. But then I can inform you that once Sweden almost took over Denmark because they walked over the frozen sea one particularly cold winter. A law was made so that if it ever happened again and the sea freezes, we are then allowed to beat every Swede who tries to cross to death with a stick. Story 6. My great-great-great-grandfather was a Union soldier who temporarily served as a prison guard at Camp Chase in Ohio, and this story passed down from his diary and journals was always fascinating to me. I've told this before, but it fits here. Whenever I see Confederate sympathizers today, this is satisfying to recall, to say the least. At least at his time, the officers tried to distinguish between the low-level conscripts and the higher-ranking officers who were more likely to truly believe in the Confederate cause. Life was tough for the conscripts as the camp got bigger, but they weren't given any additional punishment. Some were even allowed to enjoy recreation like playing baseball. For the higher-ranking officers who were captured and found to have willfully rebelled, the Union officers sentenced them to some pretty severe punishments. The aftermath of the war was uncertain, and there was strong sentiment that traitors had to be punished immediately, so the Union officers set up 5-man tribunals to hear cases and sentence traitors to punishment. My ancestor served on some such tribunals. The one that really stood out in his mind was this, given how much he wrote about it. There was a cattle barn on site, I guess to provide food and milk for the officers or maybe even the prisoners, with maybe a few dozen cattle. Confederate captive officers would be led to the barn in cuffs, forced to climb up onto a cow facing backwards, and lie down, face hanging off the end, until his face was level with the animal's rear. The Union guards would press his face into the cow's rear and bind him tightly in that position, and leave him there to serve his punishment. 8 hours a day for 3 days was a common sentence, and apparently it was feared more than any other. He recalls going into the barn on some days to get milk and seeing a line of 20 to 30 cows, all with a Confederate captive tied up face to rear, hearing all the gagging and retching as he'd pass by. Story 7. People think the French were the first country to recognize our independence, but it was actually Morocco. Kind of a funny story, actually. Benjamin Franklin was handling a good chunk of the diplomacy over there, and had heard about the Sultan's offer from a sketchy French merchant the French government had told him wasn't trustworthy. So it took a few years for us to get our affairs together and send over an ambassador. I think the Sultan might have held a ship in harbor until someone promised we'd send someone. Not sure on that one. I really want to visit there someday. They've been pretty solid allies from the beginning. Story 8. New Zealand almost had a period of prohibition, just like the United States. In 1919, the government held a referendum to decide whether or not to make alcohol illegal, and the country almost voted in favor of banning it. But while they were counting the votes, 40,000 soldiers returned from service in World War I and swung the vote back the other way. Story 9. We have been able to convince the internet that we lost a war against emus. It definitely wasn't just a few guys with a machine gun trying to cull emus, then giving up when it became apparent they were more effective at wasting ammunition than killing emus. Story 10. In my country, we celebrate independence by grilling meat, getting drunk, and blowing stuff up. Basically, we act like we are declaring independence all over again every year. Story 11. Taumata Wakatangi hanga ko ao tamatea turipukaka pikimanga horonuku pokai fenua kignatahu. We embraced this as a place name. It means the place where Tamatea, the man with big knees who slipped, climbed, and swallowed mountains, known as the land eater, played the flute to his loved one. We also have no natural land-based mammals. As David Attenborough once stated, New Zealand is where you would see what the world would be like if birds had conquered the world instead of mammals. Story 12. For over 200 years, somehow my country has had the idea that Mexican Americans and Mexican, Central, and South American people aren't indigenous. Historically and culturally, they aren't immigrants at all but are indigenous to these continents. Even though politicians say legally they aren't American citizens, they have native and indigenous bloodlines that go back long before Europeans arrived here. So why hate them? They are first people too. Story 13. Brazil. Here's a few. Our late king received votes to be United States president back in the 1800s. We declared war on France because of lobsters. There is a street in Tel Aviv named after one of our late foreign ministers. There is the possibility we declared war on Germany in World War II because the Navy mistook dolphins for submarines and shot them down. And finally, there are many countries where there are more nationals and descendants of these nationals than in the home country. Story 14. Here's one that is kind of interesting, at least to me anyway. The French were involved around the time when New Zealand was having British early settlers come in. They were present for the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, obviously not as signatories, of course. They just didn't have the resources available to beat the British to the punch and figure out Maori culture and language, not that they would have. Despite their presence from the beginning, there is very, very little French influence. I mean, around the corner from Waitangi is Dannevirke, a Dutch-influenced town. Addendum fact, in the Maori language, the French are called Waiwi, because a few of the congregation at Waitangi noticed that they said we a lot and felt it was weird. There's also the Romanized word parani, but I like Waiwi better. Story 15. We had a prime minister who thought his party was working against him. So he got utterly intoxicated, went on national television, and called a snap election. It was henceforth known as the Schnapps election, and he lost in a landslide. Story 16. How a nation that worked so hard for freedom, independence, and diversity has evolved into a chaotic display of intolerant, self-important, and corrupt individuals. Story 17. Australia, a lot of people are going to say Emu War, but I think the weirdest thing that's happened is the Rum Rebellion. While we were a colony, a bunch of military officers rebelled against the governor of New South Wales, which was what Australia was called at the time, because he tried to ban them from producing and selling rum. Story 18. My country was so poor that Ethiopia sent us aid only a couple of generations ago. My father did not have running water until he was in high school. We did not have our own government for a while. Within a few decades, we are now the 12th highest GDP in the world. No other country has developed into such an economy from having nothing in such a short amount of time. Citizens were sent to Europe to work as nurses and miners, and it was seen as a patriotic and civic duty. Story 19. In Canada, there is a province called British Columbia that has had the strangest political leaders. The second premier was named Amour de Cosmos. Story 20. We kicked a dictator out through a peaceful revolution. 36 years later, we elected his son to be president. The majority of the people in my country are gullible idiots. Story 21. It is common to see water bottles placed outside houses in Malta. This practice is believed to deter dogs from urinating near doorways, though the effectiveness is debated. Maltese is the only Semitic language written in the Latin alphabet. It has roots in Phoenician, Arabic, Italian, and English, making it an unusual linguistic mashup. According to tradition, the Apostle Paul was shipwrecked on Malta in 60 Anno Domini. This event is said to have led to the island's Christianization. Story 22. Not my country, but Sweden, changed which side of the road they drive on. That happened on the 3rd of September, 1967, at 5 a.m. Also interesting, Australia lost a prime minister on December 17, 1967, when he went for a swim. His death was commemorated in a number of ways, among them by the establishment of the Harold Holt Memorial Swimming Centre in Melbourne. We Australians do have a sense of humour. Zambia tried to launch a space program in the 1960s. Story 23. In Brazil, a priest decided to break a record and raise funds for charity by tying himself to a chair with over 1,000 helium balloons. His goal? To fly across the Atlantic. Equipped with a global positioning system, a parachute, and a very optimistic spirit, he took off. But things didn't go as planned. He ignored weather warnings, the wind blew him off course, and his global positioning system failed because he didn't know how to use it properly. He ended up floating out over the ocean, lost and unable to steer. Despite rescue efforts, the story ended tragically when his remains were found months later. While his intentions were noble, it became a cautionary tale about mixing faith, ambition, and helium balloons without proper preparation. It is remembered in Brazil as both a bizarre and bittersweet story. Story 24. The strangest thing about the United States is that one of our two political parties has become a cult that deceived 77 million people into voting against their own interests and electing a felon and rapist to the presidency. Story 25. Australia. Our Prime Minister went for a swim one day and was never found again. People now often call it a Harold Holt when you bail on something quickly. Story 26. Florida. If crimes are committed in that state, we either get called Florida man or Florida woman. It's to the point that no sane person wants to move here other than visiting for the amusement parks. Story 27. There was a lot of saber rattling, and some fighting nearly broke out between the United States and British over a United States settler shooting a pig. Story 28. Maybe not the weirdest, but the most fascinating chapter of American history is, in my opinion, Tecumseh's War, when a vast confederation of Native American tribes formed to stop American westward expansion. It was an example of a phenomenon that has repeated throughout history, where the expansion of a centralized power is challenged by an alliance of decentralized societies on its periphery. The conflict merged into the War of 1812 and, more broadly, the Napoleonic Wars. If popular rebellions like the Whiskey Rebellion or slave revolts had broken out at the same time, the United States might have been in real trouble. Story 29. Just about every day, sometimes multiple times a day, several people, often children, are randomly shot by someone who is mentally unfit to drive, let alone have a gun. A minority of people say that nothing can be done about it, and the majority just let it happen. Story 30. Some have been mentioned already, like Harold Holt or the Emu War, but mine is just the whole colony system here in Australia before Federation. I mean, sure, if one part was French or the other Dutch, etc., but all the colonies were British. This resulted in them essentially being separate countries, so you ended up with very weird situations like separate taxes, going through customs at the borders, and the worst one, which is when railways became a thing, each colony had their own gauges or even a mix, so one would be standard gauge and others narrow or broad. Also, back to the railways, they were built for connecting and moving goods from further into each colony and then into the main cities or ports, hardly ever across internal borders. Much of this was felt well after Federation in 1901. Most state taxes were amalgamated into the Goods and Services Tax in the 1990s. The issues with the railways are still felt today. Story 31. Australia was founded by people who did not want to live there. Between May 13, 1787 and January 20, 1788, 11 ships loaded with criminals sailed from the United Kingdom to Sydney, Australia. There were about 1,500 people in that fleet. About 50% were criminals and approximately 25% were Marines guarding them. Fun fact, apparently the fleet of 11 boats is the largest single-planned migration of boat people in written history. Australia doesn't celebrate its independence from the British Empire. Australia Day, historically a celebration of when Australia became a colony of the British Empire, has evolved. These days, the celebration has been redefined to commemorate something else. Story 32. Australia, just how unwilling many people are to just accept the full truth of what happened, and when confronted with proof, they then rationalize it away. Story 33, Brazilian here, and I pick lobster war with France. On July 6, 1966, the Administrative Tribunal of Rennes summarized the French government claims that lobsters are like fish, that is, that they swim about in the open sea and, therefore, could not be considered part of the continental shelf. Brazil claimed that lobsters are like oysters, in that they cling to the bottom of the ocean and, therefore, were part of the continental shelf. Admiral Paulo Moreira da Silva, Brazil's Navy expert in the field of oceanography who had been sent to assist the diplomatic committee during the general discussions, argued that for Brazil to accept the French scientific thesis that a lobster would be considered a fish when it leaps on the seafloor, then they would have in the same manner to accept the Brazilian premise that when a kangaroo hops, it would be considered a bird. The question then was resolved in favor of Brazil.